Welcome to another Unity micro tutorial. Today I'll be showing you how to make the camera follow the player and a method to allow the player to pick up items. So let's go ahead and get into it. I'm using the project we've been running with for the last two videos. I'll leave a link so you can download the project if you want to jump in from here. You can find that in the description. As you can see, we have our player sphere and a little walled in play area. If we hit play mode, as we move our sphere character around, the camera stays in the same position while the player rolls around the screen. There are multiple ways to get the camera to follow the player, so I'll go ahead and start by going over the simplest way, which won't work for our current scenario, but it is ultimately good to know and good to understand why it won't work, and then I'll move on to what will work. You can easily attach an object to another by making your secondary object a child of the original object. So let's do this real fast with our main camera. Attach the main camera from the hierarchy onto the player object by dragging it and dropping it on top of that object. So now you can see the camera is a child of the player object. So if you go ahead and move the player object around the scene, the camera will follow it perfectly. And this will actually work decently for many other types of projects, but because we're using a sphere as our player object, it is entirely unacceptable, and we'll look into why that is now. Go ahead and hit play and move your character around. As you can see, the camera rolls with the ball, which isn't what we want to do at all. The ball is rotating, so the camera, being a child of that ball, is following its exact rotations. To get a visual of this while in play mode, select the player object and look at its rotation in the inspector as you roll the ball around. You do not want the camera to be mimicking this rotation value as it follows the player. So to accomplish this, to get the camera to not listen to this value but to still follow the player, we'll have to get into a little bit of scripting. So go ahead and remove the camera from the ball by clicking and dragging it outside into empty space in the hierarchy, and then add a script to the camera called camera controller. Open up that script, and the first thing I'm going to do is add a reference to the player game object. We'll call this to figure out where the player is and to move us relative to the player position only, rather than every vector as we did before. This will have to be a public value since we're trying to access an entirely different object than the one the script is running from. Then we'll add a private vector3 called offset, which we'll use in our scripting below. InStart, which runs the moment this object is instantiated in the scene, will make the offset equal to the camera's current position subtracted by the player's current position. This will allow us to set up the camera exactly how we want it to be relative of the player in the scene view, and then it'll keep this distance and angle during play. Then, to actually affect the camera's constant position during gameplay, we'll go under Update, which runs once a frame, and make the transform position, which is the camera's transform position, since this is a script on the camera, equal to the current player position plus the offset. Go ahead and save, then go back to Unity. Make sure you set the player game object we called a reference to in the script to the player object by dragging that object into the field on camera titled player. Go ahead and set up the camera in any way that looks good to you, and then go ahead and press play to test your progress. As you can see, the camera now nicely follows the player object without spinning. Next, we'll make an extremely simple collectible item. So go ahead and create a cube and place it in front of our player in the scene. This cube will spawn with a box collider by default, which we'll use to check for collisions with other objects. Set the height to 0.5 so it's resting perfectly on the plane. To actually use this box collider, we'll have to dive into a little bit more simple code. But first, select the player object and in the inspector set the tag to player. Now, go back and select the cube object and add a script component called something like cube handler. We're going to keep this as simple as possible. All you need to do is go into this script and create a function called onCollisionEnter. This is its own function outside of any start or update function, and it runs every time something enters this object's collision area. A collision variable must be created to use this function, but if we wanted to, we could just run whatever code we wanted in here to collect our game object when we collide. The problem with that would be anything it collides with would also be collected, including the ground and walls. We must check to be sure that it is the player that it has collided with before running anything. Within the collision code, we'll make a simple if statement. We'll ask if collision.tag equals player, then destroy this game object. Later, we can keep track of score and add some fancy effects, but the first step to collecting an item is almost always destroying it. So go ahead and save this code and then go back to Unity. If you go ahead and test, you should see that the cube isn't destroyed when it touches the plane. However, the second the player object hits the cube is deleted from the scene. In the next video, we'll add some UI elements to keep track of our score and some more detailed movement mechanics for our player.